So we've just seen a wide range of species that coexist together in a xeric or dry calcareous grassland. What processes resulted in this local, within community, what we call alpha diversity? And what can we learn about coexistence in this particular plant community that we can apply to other plant communities? How can we understand biodiversity creation in general? Well, in the first part I gave you a basic overview of coexistence using the analogy of a pizza, making a pizza. And the idea is that to make a pizza, there are actually two stages. One is a longer term stage which involves making the ingredients, so agriculture, which gets you the list of ingredients that you use to make the pizza. And the second phase are short-term processes, which are basically cooking. And the analogy with the plant community, so for a community, the longer-term processes are to do with evolution, which create the list of ingredients, let's say, or in other words, the list of species. And the shorter-term processes are essentially ecology, and these ecological processes that happen within the lifetime of individuals, which are equivalent to cooking the pizza. And the other part of this analogy with a pizza is that with a pizza, there are some ingredients for which you need a lot of them to make the pizza base, and then there are other ingredients where they basically make the topping, they make it more varied, they make it more interesting, but they're required in much smaller amounts. So with a community, the equivalent there is that there are some species which are dominant, which have a very high local relative abundance, and they form our pizza base, let's say. And there are species which are much less abundant, and these are essentially the subordinate species which make the community particularly varied. So we want to ask questions such as, why are some species relatively common and others relatively rare locally? Why do some form a good solid pizza base and others make the pizza topping? How can it be that that pizza topping is so varied and so interesting? So by looking at the 64 species found here in this xeric grassland, it's evident that only a few species are locally common and a huge number are locally rare, but they do consistently form part of the vegetation. I previously explained in part 3 that the species pool, or the number of species that can take part in local plant communities, is particularly high here, because the environment is maintained in a heterogeneous and patchy way. I also explained in part 1 that in this xeric sand calcareous grassland, we measured the relative abundances of the species, and this allows us to rank the species in order of abundance, running left to right. So this is a rank abundance curve. Note that the colours, red, green, blue, represent the CSR plant functional types. So on the left we have a small number of relatively abundant species that are extreme stress tolerators. To the right of these there are less abundant species that show a mix of different functional strategies. Now there's no magic number where we can say this is dominant, this is subordinate, but I should point out that on this rising upward leg on the left, there is one species in particular, Bromus erectus, which is considered to be a dominant species in this kind of plant community. It's actually not the most abundant species here, but it's in this group. So I'm going to consider all of these 5 species as dominant. Then we have 49 species which are subordinate. So they're consistently found here and they're very low relative abundance. And this brings the total in this graph up to 54 species. Now if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that I keep saying that we found 64 species here in this grassland. And I'm not lying, it's true, because there are 10 species which fall into another category, the transients. And these are species for which basically we've found them, we've observed them locally, but their abundance is so low and they're not consistently found. Maybe only 1 or 2 individuals, something like that. They're here, so it's also correct that we say that they're here, but they don't represent perhaps a stable part of the community. So we can identify with this rank abundance curve dominants, subordinates, and then there's this group of extra species, the transients. So although the transients aren't shown here, they are actually crucial to understanding the processes of community assembly and community change But for now we'll concentrate on the more obvious processes sorting the species pool into dominant and subordinate members of the plant community. Essentially what we want to know is why some species are common and others are rare, and also how there can be so many locally rare species that are nonetheless consistently found. For the subordinate species, a much wider range of functioning is evident. Are these subordinate species present because they're potentially dominant but have in some way lost out to the current dominance? Or are they present because they're specialized and adapted to be subordinate? The answer is both. A small number are potential dominants, but most are not. They're adapted to be subordinate. How do I know this? Because a small number of species found here are also known to be dominant in other environments. For example, here the false oatgrass, Arenatherum elatius, has a very low relative abundance, but it can be the dominant grass in lowland meadows on nutrient-rich soils. Dactylis glomerata is another subordinate species here, but it can be a co-dominant with the false oatgrass in those lowland meadows. In contrast, there are species which are evidently specialized to be subordinate. So the most extreme example, I think, from the plants that we've seen at the start of this video are the parasitic plants. For example, the Orobanche alba is an obligate parasite of species in the Lamiaceae family, in the family in which we have thyme. And so the Orobanche is parasitic on the thyme, and of course a parasite can't have a higher relative abundance than its host. And if we look at this in terms of biology, we can see Orobanche as a parasite, but if we look at it through the eyes of ecology, essentially the thyme is facilitating or making easier the life of the Orobanche. So the Orobanche is adapted to be subordinate, and even the thyme itself is a subordinate species. There are other examples. For example, we saw Primula veris at the start of the season, and a very low abundance. It is consistently found in the grassland, but essentially Primula veris can survive in the grassland because it flowers early on before the grasses get tall, and so it's taking advantage of that, what we call a vernal or spring temporal niche, and kind of completing its life cycle early on. So it's clear that it's not a dominant species. It's very definitely a subordinate based on its life cycle. The orchids also provide a perfect example of species that are adapted to be subordinate. None of the species here are known to be dominant species in other environments. That's why you've heard of a grassland, but not in orchid land. Many of them use deceptive pollination mechanisms that trick insects into pollinating them without providing nectar. Okay. And for this to work, it requires a larger number of nectar-rewarding flowers that can feed and support the insects. These mechanisms would not work if the orchids were relatively abundant. So paradoxically, they must be rare locally for their reproductive adaptations to work. So they're adapted to be subordinate. The point is that all of these are examples of facilitation, with the dominant species acting as so-called ecosystem engineers, creating habitat for other species which are adapted to be subordinates. The existence of these species, the Primula veris, the orchids, the parasitic plants, for example, and I also showed in another video the epiphytic bromeliads growing on trees in central Panama. These examples all show that much of local species richness depends on the dominant species creating opportunities, creating niches for other species. So we saw in the last video that here a patchy and heterogeneous environment generates a particularly large species pool, or all of the species that can potentially participate in the community. These species are then filtered by environmental selection pressures, primarily involving the degree of competition, limiting stress factors and lethal disturbance events. As the dominant species are extreme stress tolerators, it's clear that stress tolerance is particularly important for fitness in this environment. But the subordinates show a range of CSR strategies. evidently high abundance is associated with high specialization towards stress tolerance. But low abundance can occur for a range of different strategies. Here, the facilitation comes into play. Like the tropical trees creating opportunities for the epiphytic bromeliads, the subordinates are facilitated by the dominants. We saw in part 1 that the subordinates physically occupy the gaps and spaces between clumps of dominant species. The subordinates occupy microsites that are not exploited by the dominants. They occupy a smaller scale of microhabitat. Whereas the dominants cover tens of centimeters in this particular grassland example, the subordinates occur at the scale of just a few centimeters. The mix of subordinate CSR strategies which are consistently found demonstrates that there are a greater number of heterogeneous opportunities, a kind of micro-scale patchiness. So while the ecological filtering is a strong process for the dominant species, the dominants then ameliorate filtering for the subordinates, giving them access to the community. Differences over time are also important. In previous years, we've seen a shift during the season from relatively ruderal orchid species evident when the grasses are short to larger species towards the summer when the grasses are tall. So these relationships between dominants and subordinates shift away from facilitation towards competition as the season progresses. So the importance of competition changes through the season. Coexistence of the subordinate species depends on the timing, microsite characteristics, and species traits. So with regard to timing, this can involve reproductive timing, obviously with early flowering. We saw the example of the primula and the earlier flowering orchids. But a part of the differences between species are, well, it can be to do with the growth form, for example, low-lying species with rosettes, or spreading species with lateral stems, such as the Thymus longicaudis. There are also pollination niches, different adaptations for pollination. Wind pollination in the case of Rumex acetosa. Pollination by long-tongued bees in the case of Anthillis vulneraria or Trifolium pratense. Short-tongued bees in the case of Bellis perennis. Specific bee species in the case of Ophrys sphegodes being pollinated by Andrena bees. Butterflies are important pollinators, specifically in the case of Clinopodium vulgare. Hoverflies can be important in the case of Achillea millefolium. And general insect pollination, including the beetles, for example, in the case of Centaurea nigrescens. Some of these species we've not seen yet because they flower slightly later in the year. Okay. Another important difference between species which can help coexistence is the regeneration niche. So when the seeds germinate, how they establish as young plants. Seeds germinating early in the growth season after the winter on dry micropatches of soil that are wetted early in the spring, for example, Plantago lanceolata, or seedling establishment in shallow, dry soil using rapid root growth and relatively deep tap roots. Here the best example is perhaps Salvia pratensis. Coming back to our original question, why are some species common and others rare? It's evident that some species are common because they're particularly well adapted to the general site conditions, and most are rare because they're not able to be dominant. They rely on opportunities provided by other species, perhaps resources that are found at a smaller scale than that occupied by the dominants, or because the dominants buffer the microclimate against environmental extremes, such as excessive light and heat, or where the gaps between dominants allow seedlings to establish. And these differences in physical scale are important. One question that I've left hanging until now is, why are there so many subordinate species? I also said that the transient species, those represented by just one or two individuals that don't establish stable populations, will help us to understand this process. What I mean is this. The presence of transient species is a clear demonstration of a degree of randomness and stochasticity during community assembly. Some things just happen to arrive on the wind, seeds for example, some species arrive as seeds on the wind, and this randomness can also explain why there are so many subordinate species. Year after year, decade after decade, and century after century, species travel through the environment as seeds, and there is a continuous semi-random flux of species. I say semi-random because it's constrained by the type and abundance of species in the area. The transients can arrive from surrounding vegetation and essentially be the raw material of succession and community change. So not necessarily important for the current community, but perhaps the seeds of future vegetation development if management activities should change. But here's where it gets really interesting for ecologists. We've talked about specific phenomena and processes, species pools, ecological filtering, plant functional types, in a search for rules governing the assembly of plant communities, rules that lead to predictability. Perhaps, however, the rules only apply up until a certain point, because stochasticity inevitably introduces a degree of uncertainty regarding the species that can actually enter the community. Much like the daily weather, this is something that's very difficult to predict.